Wolverine is 5'3", not 6'3" like Hugh Jackman. He's also not Australian like Hugh Jackman. Most importantly, he's 5'3", which means when sculpting him, I had to kind of change my references, in that I usually use this really archaic, kind of old, ideal male proportion reference. It has these lines for drawing with like the line of the upper body in reference to the lower body and things like that. And the reason I say archaic is because I think it's from the 1930s, maybe 50s, but the reason I use them is because they kind of work, but the female one, the female one has a nice line for her high heels, and where her real feet end and where her high heels begin, which to me is just really funny. Anyway, when using the male reference for Wolverine, I had to squash everything down a little bit, because proportionally, Wolverine doesn't make any sense. I'm gonna be perfectly honest with you. He is proportionally like a 6-foot bodybuilder at least, but then he's supposed to be 5'3", which means his head is really small in comparison to someone who is actually that height. Like, closest celebrity reference I could find was Daniel Radcliffe. Everyone wants Daniel Radcliffe to play Wolverine, maybe you do. But his head proportionally is larger in reference to his body, because he's on the slimmer side. But then Wolverine is also supposed to have shoulders that are like the same size of his head. So I kind of messed with that a little bit. With Wolverine, I gave him a massive noggin. Big old noggin. Don't know if you can see. I made him real grouchy, because that's what I want. I wanted a grouchy, kind of grumpy man with no teeth kind of vibe. He still has teeth, but the real fun for me with sculpting is always the anatomy. So with Wolverine, I got to do a bit more of anatomy, really exaggerate everything. With any superhero character, honestly, you're going to have some ridiculous anatomy and proportions. That's the fun part. Just happens that in this case, everything's supposed to be a little more closer together. So Wolverine has massive arms, massive shoulders, massive everything. He's supposed to have that X frame, basically. So big thighs and big upper body, as opposed to the nacho, the upside down Dorito everyone's after. In this case, you thicken up the neck to give him a kind of meaner appearance. I know it sounds weird to dumb everything down to like a thick neck equals meaner appearance, but that's kind of how our brains work. We simplify everything when we see it. So with Wolverine, I gave him a thick neck, thick traps, thick shoulders, which means he's definitely juicing, by the way. You want massive arms, and then the forearms, to me, are the most important part, because not only do they have to house some really impressive claws, they also kind of give an impression of strength. So in this kind of analyzing anatomy, you can change certain parts to kind of tell a story. Yeah, I'm trying to do some storytelling with anatomy, so because Wolverine is much more strong and athletic, then you would focus more on the muscularity of his upper body and lower body. And then I actually had to restart this one because I made him too thick in the midsection, which made him look more like Batman from Frank Miller Dark Knight Returns. So that thickness in the midsection kind of ages the character. So I'm sure that was on purpose with the Frank Miller Batman. In this case, I made him too thick. So I tried to really adjust the proportions to make his waist smaller, but then I added a belt on top. So he's still pretty thick, but I think it still does the trick because his upper body has that cobra vibe, right? It kind of branches out. In the actual sculpting part, I know you clicked on this probably to know how I did it. How I did it is I started with a wire armature like I always do. I used those archaic references I told you about to get the proportions more or less right, and then it varies per character, right? So with this one, everything's a little wider and shorter. So because it's wider and shorter, I start by putting on the basics in clay. The clay I use this time, which I should be using every time, is Aves Epoxy Sculpt. It's really durable. So basically it's like plumber's epoxy, where you mix 2 parts together and then it hardens over about 24 hours and then you get something damn near indestructible. I have been able to break it a lot, but I'm not very gentle with my sculptures when I work, it turns out. So put a lot of this stuff on in the important parts, and then after 24 hours you have something really durable that you can work on. So Wolverine hasn't cracked yet, haha. He works pretty well, there's no wobble, which means I have something that is durable that I could sell. Just kidding, Marvel, or am I? With the clay I use on top of the Aves Epoxy, I use Super Sculpey. I love using Super Sculpey Firm. It's the gray kind. There's 2 kinds. There's firm and medium. I use medium most of the time. Firm is really good for the base stuff like Aves Epoxy, but Aves Epoxy is just better when it comes to structural integrity. I discovered recently you can make really good looking skin tones using the beige Super Sculpey. So his face and arms are beige Super Sculpey, because I can then, no priming, no messing with the undercoat, just on the raw clay after it's been baked, I put on Army Painter Speed Paint. The color is Crusader Skin, and it tints the clay color wise, but it keeps that translucency, which is perfect for human skin. On top of that, on certain parts I put some red, like a really light red, because you do have some translucency in your arm, right? So the blood vessels, or whatever it is, I don't know that part of anatomy, all I know is muscles right now. With the lips, same thing. And then because he's hairy, I tried to brush, before baking on the raw clay, I brushed on some, I used rubbing alcohol, and then I brushed a kind of thick brush on it, and you can kind of see the bristles have an effect. So the bristles dig into the clay, and then I do a wash of brown on top of that so that the brown seeps into the cracks. It's kind of like weathering, if you're familiar with miniature painting and things like that. The next steps are my favorites. Once the anatomy is done and I can bake him, I can finally get to painting, which is my favorite part about superhero characters, is the color. All these things are just color theory to an extreme. I kind of moved away from the more obvious choice of his costume, which is the blue and yellow, which is really fun, but in the kind of grittier vibe I was going for, it doesn't work. The movies run into that issue, which is why they throw out the costume idea altogether and they give him a black leather jumpsuit, because why not? But in this case, I wanted to still have a comic book vibe. The way you get comic book vibe is really bright colors and contrasts. There's great videos on this all over YouTube. With the yellow of the pants and the head and this part of the abs, I think it's called the serratus, you get that pop of color, but then you keep everything neutral with the brown. Same thing with the brown, by the way. With the brush, I used the same technique, but I dug a little deeper because I wanted a cracked leather effect. You can see veins through his leather. It's not realistic, but it's a comic book. Pops of color are super important, and pops of different textures. I'll be saying this for the rest of my life. If you want something to look realistic, you do a very varying texture. So with his claws, I think it's the metal parts where the claws come out of. So it's like these little buttons basically, or these openings. I used let's see if I have it. I used a chrome marker, super useful. Just a pop of that on the belt and on the hands, and you have something that looks like metal. That's all you need. Then with the snow, it's another one of my favorite tricks. It's a mix of baking soda, glue, water, and white paint. The reason you use white paint is because after a while, baking soda turns yellow, and you don't want your snow to look like he peed himself. So another important part is the eyes, the expression. I didn't nail it this time. I don't think I nailed it this time. I think it's because his eyes are too flat. Usually when you have eyes, you want to keep that spherical vibe, but his eyes are too deep in his mask, I think. See how it just kind of disappears from the side? You see it a little bit, but there's no curvature. So he doesn't really have emotion other than his face. So I think the overall vibe works for the piece. Another thing that was really difficult in the sculpting part is these things. I don't know what they're called. His Wolverine ears, I guess, is the design idea. But those things are really difficult, and I had to restart a few times. The only thing I had success with was doing them first, like before anything, baking it so that they wouldn't move around, and then work on top of that. That does kind of remove a few options. For example, the texturing is kind of lazy because I didn't have anything stable to work with. The worst thing for sculpting is when something is moving around in your hands. I prefer something that stays stable, hence the Aves epoxy. So overall, I wanted this guy to have the kind of grumpy vibe, and I wanted him to be a little menacing. He's not that menacing, I think. All I've achieved is some more showing off of anatomy. I've been doing art for about my whole life, so let's say 22 years. That means that I've figured a lot of stuff out. I've done a lot of mistakes. So if you're interested in hearing what I did wrong and what you should probably be doing, take it with a grain of salt, obviously. But I have a course coming on how to sculpt the human body in about a month. So if you're interested, please subscribe. It would mean a lot to me. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one next week.